Picture this. It's 3 in the morning. You're 6 miles above the Atlantic Ocean, somewhere between North America and Europe, with nothing but black water in every direction for hundreds of miles. Then the engines stop. Both of them. The lights go out. Oxygen masks tumble from the ceiling. And 300 people aboard one of the most advanced commercial jets ever built are suddenly passengers on the world's heaviest glider, plummeting silently toward the ocean in the dark. This didn't have to happen, and the reason it did isn't the one most people assume. This is the story of Air Transat Flight 236 and the hidden psychology behind one of the most extraordinary aviation events in history. On the evening of August 23rd, 2001, 293 passengers and 13 crew climbed aboard an Air Transat Airbus A330 at Toronto Pearson International Airport, bound for Lisbon, Portugal. Most were tourists. Some were Portuguese nationals going home. Nobody had any reason to worry. The aircraft itself was practically brand new, just 2 years old, and the A330 had spent the 7 years since its launch building a reputation as one of the safest jets in commercial aviation. Its onboard computer systems monitored hundreds of sensors simultaneously, feeding the pilots a constant stream of data. In the left seat was Captain Robert Pichet, 48 years old, with over 16,000 flight hours behind him. He was a seasoned aviator who had flown everything from bush planes to seaplanes in the unforgiving conditions of northern Canada. His life story was colorful, to say the least. Before joining Air Transat, he had served time in an American federal prison after being caught smuggling drugs in a light aircraft. But whatever his past, as a professional pilot, his record was clean. Beside him sat First Officer Dirk Desjardins, 28 years old, around 5,000 hours of total experience, about 400 of those on the A330. He had joined Air Transat just a year prior after training on the Airbus type. With 48 metric tons of fuel loaded into the wings, Flight 236 pushed back at 9 p.m. local time. By all indications, it was going to be a routine 7-hour crossing. For the first 4 hours, it was. Just after 5 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, with the aircraft roughly halfway across the Atlantic, the cockpit computers threw up an unusual set of readings on engine number 2, the right-hand engine. Oil pressure, high. Oil quantity, low. Oil temperature, low. That last one was the strange part. During a normal flight, engine oil temperatures rise as the engine runs. They don't drop. The pilots had never seen this particular combination of warnings before. They pulled out their flight crew operating manuals and searched for an explanation. Nothing matched. So they did what crews are trained to do. They radioed Air Transat's maintenance control center back in Quebec, relayed the readings, and were told to stand by while the technicians looked into it. In the meantime, the passengers slept. The plane flew on, and the warning lights continued blinking. Roughly 30 minutes after the oil indications appeared, a new alert lit up the center display, a fuel imbalance between the left and right wing tanks. On its own, a fuel imbalance isn't catastrophic. It happens. The standard fix is to open a crossfeed valve so fuel can flow from one side to the other and equalize. The pilots did exactly that. But 10 minutes later, the computers were showing something that made no sense. The total fuel on board had dropped below the minimum required to reach Lisbon. They were in the middle of the ocean. They couldn't make it to Europe. and the fuel counter was still falling, fast. The only viable diversion was Lajes Airport on Terceira, one of the Portuguese Azores Islands sitting out in the mid-Atlantic. The crew set course, notified air traffic control, and began working the problem. At this point, they had approximately 7 metric tons of fuel remaining. That sounds like a lot. It's about 6% of what the A330 can carry, and the number was dropping at a rate of roughly 1 metric ton every 5 minutes. If accurate, those readings told one very clear story. There was a catastrophic fuel leak somewhere on the aircraft, but the pilots didn't believe them. This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating and where the real lesson lies. Why would 2 experienced, competent pilots look at instruments screaming fuel leak and conclude the instruments were wrong? The answer has nothing to do with incompetence. It has everything to do with how the human brain handles uncertain, high-pressure situations. When the oil pressure anomalies appeared earlier in the flight, the crew had already formed a working theory: faulty sensors. On a complex fly-by-wire jet like the A330, sensor errors aren't unusual. It was a reasonable conclusion, given the information available at the time. The problem is what psychologists call confirmation bias. Once we've built a mental model of a situation, we unconsciously filter new information through that existing lens. Evidence that fits the model gets accepted. Evidence that challenges it gets discounted. So when the fuel indicators started showing impossible numbers, levels so low they implied the aircraft had been hemorrhaging fuel for hours without anyone noticing, the pilots' minds didn't leap to fuel leak. Their minds said, another sensor problem, same as before. This wasn't carelessness. It was the brain doing exactly what brains do under cognitive load and stress, defaulting to the most recent working hypothesis and defending it. Adding to this, the captain had asked the flight attendants to look out the cabin windows and check for any visible fluid trailing off the wings. They saw nothing. The flight had been completely smooth. No turbulence, no lightning strike, no unusual sounds or vibrations. Nothing to suggest a catastrophic mechanical failure had just occurred, and the rate of loss shown by the instruments was, frankly, almost unbelievably severe. A 1 ton every 5 minutes fuel loss on a brand new aircraft, in calm conditions, 4 hours into what had been a completely normal flight. It seemed more plausible that the sensors were lying. They were not. Deep inside engine number 2, a hydraulic line and a fuel line had been routed just close enough to touch. In the weeks before Flight 236, maintenance workers had replaced a component on that engine. The replacement part was technically correct in some respects, but had been sourced from a different aircraft variant. As a result, the hydraulic line ended up in slightly closer contact with the fuel line than it should have been. At altitude, vibrating under normal operating conditions, the hydraulic line gradually wore through the outer casing of the fuel pipe. Once that casing failed, fuel began spraying directly into the hot engine at a ferocious rate. This explained everything: the oil temperature anomaly, the oil quantity readings, the fuel imbalance, the plummeting fuel counter. It was all one event, one leak, one maintenance error made weeks earlier. There was no warning light for this specific failure mode. The A330's software, for all its sophistication, had no dedicated alert for high rate of fuel loss consistent with a leak. The only way the crew could have caught it was by carefully tracking the rate of change in each tank, something that's extremely difficult to do under the workload of an emergency diversion, while simultaneously managing ATC, communications, and maintenance coordination. There was also a checklist available for a suspected fuel leak. The problem, following it, required the crew to descend from 39,000 feet to 20,000 feet. The captain looked at that option and said no. On the surface, this seems like a strange call, but it's actually a predictable product of another well-documented cognitive phenomenon: framing bias. When we make decisions under risk, we tend to frame our choices in terms of guaranteed losses versus possible losses. Descending to 20,000 feet was a certain loss of altitude. Altitude the captain knew he'd want if they eventually ran out of fuel and needed every foot of glide range to reach the island. Running out of fuel at 39,000 feet, on the other hand, was a possible bad outcome. Worse in some ways, but not guaranteed. Research in decision psychology consistently shows that people in high-stakes situations prefer to gamble on avoiding a worse outcome than to accept a smaller certain loss. The captain's reasoning, better to stay high and maybe be fine than to definitely give up altitude, was psychologically natural, but it meant the fuel leak checklist was never run. And by the time any doubt had been removed, it was already too late. At 6:13 a.m., engine number 2 flamed out. The captain pushed the remaining engine to maximum thrust and began descending. The first officer declared a full emergency to Santa Maria Air Traffic Control. They had 600 kilograms of fuel left. Lajes Airport was still 240 kilometers away. 13 minutes later, engine number 1 flamed out as well. Every screen in the cockpit went dark. The cabin plunged into blackness. The low hum of the air conditioning, a sound so constant passengers never consciously notice it, disappeared. In its place, silence, wind, the creak of the airframe. A small turbine called the ram air turbine, deployed automatically from the aircraft's belly, spinning in the slipstream to generate just enough electricity to keep the captain's primary instruments alive and a handful of critical systems online. The flight attendants moved through the darkened cabin, instructing passengers to adopt brace positions. They told them to prepare for a water landing. At night, in the open Atlantic, a ditching in the heavy swells was unlikely to be survivable for most people on board. Captain Pichet had one job: make the island. The A330 is not a glider. It was engineered to fly with 2 large turbofan engines producing continuous thrust. Without them, it descends at roughly 2,000 feet per minute. From 33,000 feet, that gave him about 15 minutes, no more, to cover more than 100 kilometers. The loss of both engines had also degraded the aircraft's hydraulic systems, meaning the tail stabilizer was harder to operate. Many of the wing spoilers were offline, and if he did reach the runway, he would have no reverse thrust and compromised anti-skid braking. The aircraft would be fast, heavy, and difficult to stop. The tower at Lajes began switching the runway lights on and off rhythmically, a lighthouse in the darkness, so the crew could pick it out visually from a distance. Pichet flew the glide at a speed carefully balanced between maximum lift and the stall warning threshold. Too slow, and the plane would fall out of the sky. Too fast, and the landing gear might not deploy safely. He needed to stay above 140 knots to keep the ram air turbine spinning, but below 200 knots to get the gear down. His only tool for managing airspeed was the aircraft's pitch attitude. Nose up to slow down, nose down to speed up. As they closed on the island, a new problem emerged. He had been conservative, deliberately staying high to preserve options, and he had been too conservative. 8 miles out, the aircraft was at 13,000 feet. On a normal approach, it would have been at 3,000. With no engine power to slow down and a fast, steep descent path that would make landing impossible, Pichet did something that must have tested every nerve in the cabin. He turned away from the airport. He flew a complete 360-degree circle to burn off altitude, half of it with the runway behind him, receding into the dark. When the wings leveled and the runway reappeared ahead, he was still slightly high, not enough for another full circuit. So he flew a series of sharp S-turns, banking hard left, then hard right, dragging the nose around to bleed off the remaining excess altitude before lining up on final approach. At Lajes, every emergency vehicle on the base had been scrambled. Fire engines, ambulances, and rescue crews lined the taxiways in the dark, waiting. The A330 came in fast, about 200 knots, compared to the typical 145, because without flaps, there was no other option. The first officer called out airspeed and altitude in a steady voice as the runway lights rushed toward them. The main gear hit the tarmac hard. 8 of the 12 tires burst on impact. The aircraft bounced, slammed back down, and began a long, shrieking skid. No thrust reversers, no effective spoilers, locked wheels grinding down to bare metal. After what must have felt like an eternity, the aircraft stopped. All 306 people on board were alive. The captain ordered an evacuation. Every passenger was off the aircraft within 90 seconds. Fires had broken out in the wheel assemblies on the left main gear. The fire crews had them out within minutes. The initial reaction was, understandably, that Pichet and Desjardins had performed something close to a miracle. They had completed the longest dead-stick glide of a commercial passenger aircraft in aviation history, a record that still stands today. A year later, both pilots received the Superior Airmanship Award from the Airline Pilots Association. But the investigation that followed asked harder questions. Accident investigators determined that if the crew had initiated any of the available fuel leak procedures at any point after beginning their diversion, even the general fuel leak, source not identified checklist, they would have landed at Lajes with nearly 4 metric tons of fuel to spare. The whole emergency phase would never have happened. The report cited the confirmation and framing biases that influenced the crew's decision-making. It noted that neither pilot had received any training on fuel leak identification or the associated procedures during their time at Air Transat. It also pointed out that the A330's software, for all its capabilities, had no system to flag an abnormally high rate of fuel loss. The report did not let the airline's maintenance practices off the hook either. The wrong part installed by a technician weeks before the flight was, in the final analysis, the root cause of everything that followed. In the wake of Flight 236, Airbus updated the A330's flight management system to include an alert specifically designed to warn pilots when fuel is depleting faster than expected, a warning that should have existed from day one. Air Transat overhauled its training programs to include extended range operations, fuel management, and diversion procedures as core curriculum rather than afterthoughts. The record that Pichet and Desjardins set, and the circumstances that produced it, made sure those gaps could never be ignored again. The most remarkable thing about Flight 236 isn't the landing, extraordinary as it was. It's what the flight reveals about how human beings process information under pressure. Two intelligent, experienced, well-trained pilots looked at instruments warning them of a catastrophic fuel leak and, for entirely understandable psychological reasons, concluded those instruments were wrong. They weren't being reckless. They weren't being negligent. They were being human, building a model of the world, defending it under stress, and making decisions that felt rational in the moment. The gap between rational in the moment and correct in hindsight is where most disasters live. Understanding that gap in aviation, in medicine, in business, in everyday life is one of the most valuable things we can do.